Okay, welcome back. Today, what we're going to talk about is the rationales and promises of Western engagement. So, I mentioned a couple cases before of NGOs, and we talked about social movements. Today, we're going to look at how Western states engage in democracy support and what the policy options are. What are the advantages and disadvantages of these? So, we'll discuss various pros and cons of democracy support. I'm just going to make sure this is recording because I just recorded something and it didn't work at all, but this is working. Good. Um, So the rise of international democratic legitimacy and the end of the Cold War, which are, again, two interrelated phenomena, um, these led to a determination in the West that democratization should suddenly occupy a key goal of foreign policy. Earlier on, we talked about the notion of democratic legitimacy from World War II on. Today, we're going to look at more specific democracy promotion activities, and we'll focus on the U.S., which has undoubtedly been the most active and brazen in its democracy support program. A caveat here is never forget that democracy can still take a backdoor to other geostrategic interests. It frequently does. But starting in the 1990s, it became more of a goal in and of itself than it ever had been before. This was exemplified by the huge growth of the USAID's Democracy and Governance program. Over the 1990s, it grew from $128 million in 1990 to $817 million in 2003. So that's a 538% rate of growth at a time when AID on the whole had only about 19% growth. So huge growth and new concentration on democracy and governance. Now, in the last class, I mentioned various types of pro-democracy organizations, including those that were oriented toward development assistance, especially in the cases of Chile and the Philippines. Keep in mind that these developmental assistance organizations can also translate into indirect forms of democracy assistance as well. They do a few things. First of all, they create civic ties, what I keep talking about, the restoring of these horizontal ties in populations where horizontal ties have been attacked. They also, relatedly, help create greater levels of interpersonal trust within people in society, and that's going to help facilitate any sort of movement. They can also promote modernization. Go back to modernization theory. Better economic performance leads to increased urbanization and the rise of a middle class, the people who are the natural leaders of any movement. And finally, you've got pre-existing organizations in these various developmental organizations that can serve as building blocks to more politically active or more politically attentive organizations in the future. So they might start off now by talking about how to plant seeds, by talking about how to use fertilizers and pesticides, by talking about, how to operate certain machinery in the factories. But eventually, they can become these building blocks for more politically oriented groups, as we've talked about before, as civil society transforms itself. At the same time, Western states have been involved in much more targeted democracy assistance as well. And the goal is to build what we call constituencies for reform. So educate and empower voters. Make people within society want and demand accountability for those who are running the state. Support political parties, opposition political parties, as well as other important organized actors like labor unions. Because all of these, the political parties, the labor unions, these are the actors in society that can best organize their own people if given the proper tools, the proper know-how, the proper resources. Strengthen human rights groups. They can serve as the eyes and the ears of society. When we talked last class about dissidents, what do? Well, they tell people what's not right. They tell people where the state is failing. People might not see everything for themselves. They often don't see everything for themselves, especially if they're uninvolved in politics and they don't know people who are involved in politics. They might not see what can happen if you cross that line. And very importantly, strengthen the independent press. Get the message out. That's what the independent press does. It gets the message out about these human rights violations, about a viable opposition. It helps educate and empower voters. Tell people what the government is up to. You need an independent press. An independent press is critical for all of these functions. There's only so far that the underground press can take you. All of this has given birth to what is sometimes referred to as the transition paradigm. This is a big picture concept that you should always keep in the back of your mind, and which we'll explore in greater detail later in the class. The idea is that donors first push for an opening in non-democratic states by trying to strengthen civil society, all the types that we've just talked about. And then upon democratic breakthrough, in other words, when real democracy comes, electoral mechanistic forms of democracy, they shift their support to electoral bodies, enabling, for example, the rapid registration of voters, the efficient printing of ballots, the honest counting of those ballots, the legitimization of free and fair elections by international election observer teams. So it goes from civil society to a focus on the mechanisms of democracy, and then finally and subsequently to a focus on strengthening key democratic actors and institutions, the legislature, the judiciary, local governments. This is the democratization template from a foreign policy perspective, and it's been frequently criticized on two grounds. One is that it tends to be short-sighted. It means that you lose the civil society capacity that you've spent so much time building in the long run. In the long run, if you quit supporting it, where are these organizations going to go to gain support? They're often not self-supporting organizations. And the second critique is that these tend to be really based on an overly mechanistic view of democracy. In other words, get democracy going, and the state institutions will take care of the rest. And we know from democratization experiences that state institutions don't always take care of the rest. You need to focus more on society and how society can participate in the democratic sphere after democratic breakthrough and between electoral cycles.